Snow had a way of erasing mistakes. It buried footprints, softened screams, and convinced people they were safe until they weren't. If you want the truth before the lights go out, hit like and subscribe. The snowfall began lightly, almost politely, as the carriage carrying Clara Whitmore wound through the hills of Evergreen Hollow, a quiet township tucked deep in the northern reaches of Vermont. By the time Iron Gates emerged from the white haze ahead, the flakes had thickened into a steady curtain, muting the world into silence. The carriage stopped before Hawthorne Estate, its stone facade glowing under oil lamps, every window warm and welcoming. Clara stepped down carefully, tightening her wool scarf as cold crept beneath her collar. The estate looked exactly as she remembered, dignified, orderly, festive in a restrained, almost deliberate way. Margaret Hawthorne, owner of the estate, was known throughout the county for her annual Christmas charity banquet. The event funded local shelters and schools, and attendance was less a choice than a civic expectation. Clara had received her invitation weeks earlier, handwritten and sincere. "Christmas loses its meaning without honest company," the note had read. A footman hurried down the steps, brushing snow from the railing as he smiled in practiced relief. "Miss Whitmore, welcome. Mrs. Hawthorne is waiting in the west parlor." Inside, warmth closed around her at once. Evergreen garlands lined the banisters. Pine wreaths hung heavy with red ribbon. The air carried mulled wine, citrus peel, and candle smoke. Somewhere beyond the walls, a choir rehearsed softly, voices overlapping, searching for harmony. Clara removed her coat and handed it to a young maid whose excitement barely masked her nerves. "It's already busy," Clara observed quietly. "Yes, miss," the girl whispered. "Almost everyone's arrived, except, well, you'll see." The west parlor glowed with firelight. Margaret Hawthorne stood near the hearth, composed in dark emerald silk, her posture elegant but tense. When she noticed Clara, her expression softened instantly. "My dear Clara, I'm so glad you came." They exchanged warm greetings. Margaret gestured toward the room. "It's chaos as always. December does that to a house." "It's beautiful," Clara said honestly. "Everything feels cared for." Margaret smiled, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. "That would be thanks to Edwin Moore. I don't know what I'd do without him." As if summoned, Edwin appeared near the sideboard. Slight, bespectacled, meticulously dressed, he carried a tray of polished glasses and nodded shyly. "I hope the journey wasn't difficult, Miss Whitmore." "Not at all," Clara replied. "The snow behaved." "For now." Margaret lowered her voice as Edwin moved away. "He works too hard. I keep telling him rest is not a failure." Clara noticed the affection there, genuine, protective. Introductions followed. Charles Hawthorne, Margaret's nephew, leaned against a chair with a glass already half empty. His manners were correct, his eyes sharp and dissatisfied. Resentment clung to him like a second coat. Nearby stood Lucas Reed, conductor of the estate choir. He spoke with easy charm, gesturing animatedly about a special arrangement planned for the evening. Yet beneath the performance, Clara caught the tension, fingers tapping, eyes flicking toward the hallway. The final introduction came in the form of Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, efficient, observant. Her gaze missed nothing. As Clara stepped back into the corridor, the choir's voices swelled. Margaret gestured toward the conservatory doors. "They'll rehearse beneath the holly arch tonight. The winter garden looks magical under snow." Through the glass, lanterns illuminated white branches and a tall arch crowned with holly and mistletoe. Snow dusted everything evenly, carefully, like a scene arranged for memory. "It's lovely," Clara murmured. Margaret's hands twisted together. "I only hope the storm doesn't worsen. The forecast was unclear." Clara turned to her. "Is something wrong?" A pause, a glance back toward the parlor, toward Charles. "Family complicates things," Margaret said finally, "especially when expectations don't align." Clara noted it. Hosts noticed fractures before guests ever did. As they returned inside, music filled the halls again. Laughter followed. Glasses clinked. Outside, snow continued to fall quietly, patiently, sealing Hawthorne Estate away from the rest of the world. Christmas had arrived, and something else had arrived with it. Dinner at Hawthorne Estate unfolded with practiced elegance. Candlelight reflected in crystal, silverware chimed softly, and restrained laughter drifted between courses. Outside, snow pressed against the windows in thickening sheets, dulling the world beyond the glass. Clara Whitmore sat midway along the table, listening politely as a local councilman spoke at length about zoning disputes and winter road budgets. She nodded when appropriate, but her attention wandered. The house felt tight, as though the walls were listening. Edwin Moore moved efficiently between guests, refilling glasses, adjusting chairs, correcting details no one else noticed. He kept his gaze low, posture attentive. More than once, Clara caught Margaret Hawthorne watching him with concern, as if silently urging him to slow down. Dessert arrived, a layered cranberry trifle crowned with sugared rosemary. Just as spoons touched porcelain, a sharp gust rattled the windows. The wind howled long and hollow. "Well," Charles Hawthorne remarked dryly, lifting his glass, "looks like we're all staying the night." "Cozy?" Mrs. Collins shot him a warning look. "This house is not an inn, sir." Before Charles could reply, a scream tore through the hall, high, piercing, close. For a frozen second, no one moved. Then chaos, chairs scraped back. Glass shattered. Voices overlapped in panic as guests surged toward the sound. Clara was already standing, heart steady, mind alert. She followed the scream through the side corridor toward the conservatory. Cold air rushed in as the doors stood open. A maid stood at the threshold, face drained of color, one hand clutched to her chest, the other pointing. Clara pushed past her. Beneath the holly arch in the winter garden lay Edwin Moore. His body rested at an unnatural angle on the stone tiles, spectacles askew, eyes open and fixed on the lantern-lit glass ceiling above. Snow drifted down through the open panels, settling on his coat, light, careless, almost gentle. Margaret Hawthorne cried out and staggered forward before Mrs. Collins caught her arm. "No, no, Edwin." Lucas Reed rushed in, then stopped short, breath hitching. Charles lingered behind him, face pale, not with grief but shock. The choir clustered near the doorway, whispering frantically. Clara knelt beside the body without touching it. She checked for breath, for pulse. Nothing. He had been dead several minutes. Her gaze moved quickly now, professional, precise. One lantern beside the arch was dark, its wick cold. The others burned steadily. Near Edwin's left hand lay a shard of glass, glittering faintly. Clara leaned closer. A broken ornament, silver filigree, decorative unmistakably from the large tree in the main hall. Why was it here? "This must have been a fall," Charles said too quickly. "The stones get slick in snow." "Perhaps," Clara replied, not looking at him. She studied the ground. The snowfall had begun to cover the evidence, but not completely. Several footprints remained, heavy, sharply defined heel marks leading away from the arch. Not Edwin's. His service shoes were soft-soled. These prints were narrow, intentional. Mrs. Collins pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely. "He came out here to check the lanterns. He always did." "Except this one is extinguished," Clara said quietly. "Did he ever put them out?" "No," the housekeeper whispered. "Never." The wind surged again, stirring the holly above them. White berries trembled, glowing eerily in the lantern light. Clara stood slowly. "This was no accident," she said. Margaret looked at her, eyes wide with dawning horror. Outside, the storm tightened its grip on the estate. Snow fell harder now, erasing paths, sealing exits, swallowing sound. Clara Whitmore took in the scene one last time, the darkened lantern, the broken ornament, the wrong footprints. Someone inside Hawthorne Estate had planned for darkness, and they were still here. By the time the doors to the winter garden were sealed, Hawthorne Estate no longer felt like a celebration trapped by snow. It felt like a containment. Guests gathered in tight clusters throughout the house, voices lowered, movements cautious. Fires burned in every room, yet no one seemed warm. Outside, the blizzard roared unchecked, piling snow against the windows until the glass looked frosted from within. Clara guided Margaret Hawthorne to the west parlor and ensured she was seated, wrapped in a heavy shawl. The woman's hands shook as she held her tea. Edwin was careful, Margaret said, staring into the cup. Always careful. Someone must have frightened him. Or stopped him, Clara replied gently. With no chance of authorities reaching the estate before morning, Clara began her work. Her first stop was the billiard room. Charles Hawthorne stood alone there, lining up a shot with exaggerated focus. A glass of brandy rested on the table's edge. The fire behind him crackled sharply. "You said Edwin slipped," Clara began. "Charles struck the ball too hard, it clacked against the rail, because that's the simplest explanation. Simplest isn't always correct," Charles exhaled sharply. "I was here all evening, ask anyone." "I will," Clara said calmly. Her eyes drifted to his cuff, faint gray residue clung to the fabric. "Ash," she noted. "From the fireplace," Charles stiffened. "I burned a letter earlier, private correspondence." "From your aunt," his jaw tightened. "She refuses to reconsider certain decisions." Bitterness. Long-standing, motivated, but bitterness alone did not push a man into the snow. Clara moved on. The ballroom was dim now, chairs stacked, music stands abandoned. The choir murmured quietly near the far wall. Lucas Reed stood apart, hands clasped too tightly. "You were distressed earlier," Clara said, before anyone else spoke. Lucas forced a thin smile. "I dislike disorder." "And exposure," Clara added. He flinched. "In the music room," Clara continued, "your scores contained irregular notations, lines between staves, phrases that didn't belong." Lucas swallowed. "Artistic flourishes, or messages." His composure cracked just enough. "Please, I'm under enough strain." "Strain makes people careless," Clara said, "or bold." He shook his head quickly. "I had no quarrel with Edwin, perhaps not, but fear lingered on him like sweat." In the service corridor, Clara found Mrs. Collins scrubbing her hands at the basin. The skin was red and raw. "He told me he had a duty," the housekeeper murmured. "Something important. He wouldn't explain." "Did you argue with him?" Mrs. Collins froze. "It was nothing, truly." "Nothing rarely ends in silence," Clara said softly. Tears welled. "He said someone here wasn't who they claimed to be. He wouldn't name them. Only said he was afraid. Afraid enough to go into the storm alone." Clara returned to the conservatory doors. Through the glass, the holly arch stood motionless, lanterns glowing faintly. Snow continued its slow burial of the ground. Edwin Moore had not wandered into darkness by chance. Someone had lured him there, or cornered him. And someone inside this house was hiding more than fear behind their Christmas smile. Morning never truly arrived at Hawthorne Estate. The storm dimmed the daylight into a permanent gray, pressing against the windows like a held breath. Snow packed the ground so deeply that even the garden paths had vanished. Clara Whitmore returned to the winter garden alone. The stone where Edwin Moore had fallen was now clean, brushed by Mrs. Collins at first light. Too clean. Clara studied the lantern pedestal again. A faint scuff marked the stone edge, angled downward, as if someone had braced themselves suddenly, or been shoved. She followed the remaining footprints as far as the storm allowed. One set was unmistakably Edwin's. The other was narrower, lighter, deliberate. Not a man rushing, someone careful. Clara turned back toward the house. She found Margaret Hawthorne in her private sitting room, seated at a small writing desk. The woman was twisting a pearl brooch in her fingers, over and over. "Miss Whitmore," she whispered, "please tell me you found something." "I need to ask you directly," Clara said, closing the door. "Did Edwin have responsibility over any documents last night?" Margaret inhaled sharply. "Yes," she admitted. "I entrusted him with a sealed envelope. It contained revisions to my will." Clara remained silent. "I intended to announce the changes during tonight's toast," Margaret continued. "The majority of my estate was to be redirected to the county orphan fund. Edwin was to safeguard the papers until then." "And now?" Clara asked. Margaret opened the desk drawer. It was empty. "It's gone. A missing will. A murdered steward. Motive had just sharpened." Clara left the room and made her way to the music corridor. Sheet music lay scattered across the piano where the choir had rehearsed. She gathered several pages, scanning the handwritten notes. One carol caught her attention. Between the printed lyrics, faint pencil marks had been added, not musical. Words. Beneath green boughs, truth waits. Clara's fingers paused. Beneath the holly arch, or beneath something hidden. She examined the page more closely. The paper felt thicker than the rest. Carefully, she pressed along the margin. A seam lifted slightly. Whatever had been concealed there was gone. Footsteps echoed behind her. Lucas Reed stood in the corridor, pale and restless. "You're reading my work," he said, trying for ease. "I'm reading messages hidden in it," Clara replied. Lucas's jaw tightened. "They're symbolic. Nothing more." "Then you won't mind telling me where you were an hour before dinner?" He hesitated. "Rehearsing, always rehearsing." "Alone?" Another pause, too long. "I was afraid," Lucas admitted quietly. Edwin knew I had exaggerated my credentials. He intended to tell Mrs. Hawthorne. "And the envelope?" Lucas shook his head quickly. "I hid it, yes, in the music sheets. To buy time, I never harmed him." Clara believed him. Reluctantly, as she stepped back toward the conservatory, something near a potted fir caught her eye. Another footprint, small, narrow, almost certainly a woman's, not Mrs. Collins. Clara straightened slowly. Two people had confronted Edwin Moore that night. Only one had pushed. By midday, the storm showed no mercy. Snow buried the lower windows, climbed the doors, and pressed against the estate with quiet insistence. Hawthorne Estate no longer felt isolated, it felt claimed, sealed into a single, narrowing outcome. No one had slept well. Footsteps echoed too loudly. Voices dropped instinctively. Fires burned, but the warmth never reached anyone's hands. Clara Whitmore moved through the house slowly, observing without interruption. Fear revealed itself in habits, who lingered near exits, who avoided windows, who watched others instead of the room. She reconstructed the timeline again, who knew about the will, who moved freely between corridors, who had reason to act quickly. Near noon, Margaret Hawthorne summoned everyone to the west parlor. She stood straight, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her. "Edwin believed in order," she said. "In honoring commitments, I will proceed with the Christmas toast tonight." The reaction was immediate. "Proceed," Charles snapped. "A man was killed." "And what is your alternative?" Mrs. Collins shot back. "Sit in silence and wait to be picked off." Clara watched closely. Charles's anger was sharp, outward. Lucas Reed avoided eye contact entirely. The choir stood rigid like children awaiting punishment. Fear expressed itself in angles. Preparations resumed under strain. The choir rehearsed again, stripped of cheer. Lucas corrected tempo too often, his voice tight. When he thought no one watched, his hands shook. Charles hovered near the drinks, never drunk, only vigilant. Mrs. Collins supervised the staff with mechanical focus, grief sealed behind efficiency. As dusk approached, Clara returned to the winter garden. The holly arch loomed beneath the glass ceiling. Lanterns glowed faintly through the frost. Snow erased nearly everything except what had been disturbed. She knelt beside the lantern pedestal. A shallow groove marked the stone, clean, recent, a place where someone had braced their weight. Clara followed the line upward with her eyes to the decorative garland stretched above the dining table beam, twine, recently tensioned. Inside, candlelight reclaimed the hall. The table gleamed with forced normalcy. The air felt rehearsed. Margaret rose, glass lifted. "My friends," she began, "tonight we remember generosity, loyalty," and a sharp snap cracked through the room. Clara moved without hesitation. The garland tore free, heavy with wire and glass. Clara seized Margaret's arm and pulled hard. The garland slammed into the table where Margaret had stood moments earlier. Ornaments exploded. Candles scattered. Guests screamed and stumbled back as embers danced across linen. This was no accident. Mrs. Collins rushed forward to smother flames. Charles froze, face drained of color. The choir pressed together in stunned silence. Clara lifted a severed piece of twine from the wreckage. The cut was precise, deliberate. Margaret clutched Clara's sleeve. "That was meant for me." Yes, Clara said quietly, and it was rushed. Her eyes swept the room. Lucas Reed stood near the beam, hands half raised, breath shallow. I was adjusting ribbons, he stammered. They looked uneven. Clara studied him carefully. His fear was genuine but reactive, not controlled. Something didn't align. The killer had failed once, and failure had forced their hand. By morning, someone here would break. Christmas morning arrived without ceremony. The storm had finally weakened, leaving the world outside Hawthorne Estate pale, buried, and unnaturally still. Snow clung to trees and windows like a held breath. Inside the house, silence ruled, tense, deliberate, fragile. No one lingered at breakfast. Clara Whitmore watched them carefully. Fear had matured overnight. Panic had sharpened into calculation. Everyone understood the same truth now. The killer had failed once, and failure rarely ended an intention. Clara asked that all guests remain within the main rooms until further notice. No wandering, no solitude. The request was met with reluctant compliance. She began again, not from the crime, but from the pressure points. Edwin Moore had not been murdered for what he was, but for what he knew. The missing will confirmed that, but knowledge alone did not explain escalation. Someone had been willing to kill twice. That required desperation, not greed alone. She started with Charles Hawthorne. He stood near the window, staring at the snowbound grounds. His anger had cooled into something duller, resignation. "You knew your aunt planned to alter the inheritance," Clara said. Charles nodded once. "She always does, charities, causes, people who don't share blood." "You argued with Edwin." "Yes," no denial, because he supported her. "But you didn't know the will was already finalized," Clara pressed. Charles turned sharply. "No. If I had, I would have confronted her, not him." Truth rang there, selfish but open. Lucas Reed was next. The choir director sat alone in the music room, hands folded, eyes hollow. "You hid the envelope," Clara said. "Not to steal it, to delay exposure." Lucas nodded weakly. "I needed time, that's all." "You had motive," Clara continued, "but not control. Panic doesn't cut twine cleanly." Lucas looked up at her then, understanding flickering through fear. Mrs. Collins answered fewer questions. Grief still ruled her movements, but grief did not align with precision. Finally, Clara returned to the detail that refused to fade. The second set of footprints, light, narrow, measured. Not the housekeeper's, not Edwin's, not Charles's, and Lucas, for all his nerves, moved heavily, carelessly. Clara walked the service corridors slowly, observed who moved quietly, who blended into routine. One person had done exactly that since the first scream. Margaret Hawthorne's private secretary. Eleanor Pike had spoken little. She had cried at appropriate moments. She had remained useful, fetching blankets, calming guests, organizing notes. Invisible competence. Clara requested the household records. Eleanor provided them without hesitation, too quickly. Clara studied the charity ledgers that evening. Numbers aligned mostly, but some entries repeated in small increments. Modest, consistent, the kind that slipped past casual review. If the will redirected the estate, audits would follow. Eleanor would be exposed. Clara closed the ledger slowly. Edwin Moore had been the last safeguard, and the first obstacle. As dusk returned, Clara gathered everyone in the west parlor once more. Faces turned toward her, tense, expectant. "I know who killed Edwin Moore," she said evenly. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. "And I know who tried to kill Margaret Hawthorne." Eyes darted. One figure stiffened. Clara's gaze locked, steady, unblinking. "But before I say it aloud," she continued, "I want the killer to understand something." She stepped closer to the fire. "There are no more places to hide in this house." The west parlor held its breath. Firelight flickered across rigid faces. Outside, snow slipped from branches in soft collapses, as if the world itself were listening. Clara Whitmore stood near the hearth, steady, unhurried. This was not a moment for drama. It was a moment for order. "Edwin Moore did not die because of chance," Clara said. "He died because he stood between truth and concealment." She turned first toward Charles Hawthorne. "You resented Edwin. she said calmly. You argued with him, but resentment does not create precision. You burn letters in anger, you do not plan in silence. Charles said nothing. Relief flickered across his face despite himself. Clara shifted her gaze to Luca's read. You feared exposure. You hid the envelope to delay discovery. But you are not a man who escalates. Panic makes mistakes. It does not calculate weight, height, leverage. Lucas swallowed hard. I never meant anyone harm. I know, Clara replied. Her attention moved last deliberately to Alina Pike. Margaret Hawthorne turned slowly, confusion giving way to disbelief. Alina, she whispered. Alina's posture remained composed, but her hands tightened around each other. You were the last person Edwin spoke to, Clara said. Mrs. Collins heard him mention a duty. That duty was delivering the revised will to you. Alina shook her head faintly. I was helping him. That's all. You were managing the charity accounts, Clara continued. Small sums diverted, carefully, repeatedly, nothing dramatic, enough to survive unnoticed. Silence deepened. If the estate shifted fully to charitable oversight, Clara said, those accounts would be audited. Your theft would surface. Margaret gasped softly. Edwin discovered it, Clara went on. He confronted you beneath the holly arch. You extinguished the lantern. You threw the ornament to startle him, and when he didn't yield, you pushed. Alina's breath came faster now. He slipped, she whispered. I didn't mean. Intent matters less than consequence, Clara said gently. And afterward you panicked. She turned to the ruined garland. You cut the twine above the dining table. You meant to kill Margaret Hawthorne before the will could be announced. One death had already occurred. You believed another would disappear beneath grief and confusion. Alina's composure shattered. Tears streamed freely now. I only borrowed, she sobbed. I was going to repay it. Edwin wouldn't listen. Margaret covered her mouth, grief and betrayal colliding. At that moment, boots crunched outside. The storm had finally loosened its grip. A constable entered, snow clinging to his coat. Clara stepped aside. It's over, she said quietly. Alina Pike was led away without resistance. Later, as calm slowly returned to Hawthorne Estate, Margaret stood beside Clara at the window. You gave me my house back, she said softly. And the truth, Clara nodded. Truth has weight, it always leaves marks. As Clara gathered her coat, the choir resumed, tentative, careful, but honest. Snow reflected pale sunlight across the grounds. Another case closed. Another silence broken. If you want to stay with cases like this, drop a like and subscribe. And tell me, did you suspect Alina early, or did the truth catch you off guard?